In the quiet darkness of a makeshift photography studio inside the Cathedral of Turin, a man named Secondo Pia was about to change the history of Christianity forever. The date was May 28, 1898. For centuries, the Shroud of Turin, a 14-foot linen cloth bearing the faint, ghostly image of a crucified man, had been revered as a holy relic by the faithful and dismissed as a medieval painting by the skeptics. But no one had ever looked at it through the lens of modern science, until now. Secondo Pia had been granted permission by the King of Italy to take the first official photograph of the cloth. As he developed the large glass plate in his darkroom, watching the chemicals reveal the image, he almost dropped the plate in terror. What appeared on the glass was not the faint, blurry stain seen by the naked eye. It was a crystal-clear, high-contrast portrait of a majestic face. Pia realized something impossible. The image on the cloth was itself a photographic negative. When he reversed the colors to make a negative, the face on the shroud became a positive. This revelation sent shockwaves through the scientific community. It presented a baffling paradox. If the shroud were a medieval forgery created in the 1300s, how could an artist paint a photographic negative 5 centuries before photography was invented? How could a painter understand the concept of light inversion perfectly, creating shadows where there should be light and light where there should be shadows, in a way that is only visible when inverted by a camera? To understand the magnitude of this mystery, we must look at the object itself. The shroud is a linen cloth woven in a specific 3:1 herringbone pattern, measuring roughly 4.4 meters long by 1.1 meters wide. It bears the double image, front and back, of a man who has suffered a traumatic death. But the cloth is also a survivor. It is scarred by 2 parallel lines of scorched fabric, the result of a fire in 1532 at the Sainte-Chapelle in Chambéry, France, where molten silver from the reliquary dripped onto the folded linen. These burn marks are aggressive and dark, easily visible, yet the image of the man lies between them, incredibly subtle, almost disappearing if you stand too close. The documented history of the cloth is as complex as the image itself. It surfaced clearly in historical records in the 1350s in the possession of a French knight, Godefroy de Charny, in the small town of Lire. From there, it passed to the royal house of Savoy, who guarded it for centuries. Critics argue that its sudden appearance in the Middle Ages is proof of forgery. They claim it was a clever device to generate pilgrimage money. But Secondo Pia's photograph destroyed the painting theory for many. A painter paints what his eyes see, a positive image. No artist in history has ever naturally painted a negative, because the human brain does not process light that way. The moment that glass plate developed in 1898, the shroud ceased to be merely a religious object. It became a crime scene. And the question shifted from, is it holy, to a far more dangerous one. What created this image? Once the photographic evidence established the image's clarity, the medical community began to take interest. In the 20th century, surgeons, pathologists, and forensic experts conducted what can only be described as a virtual autopsy of the man on the cloth. What they found was not a painting, but a precise 3-dimensional map of torture that contradicted nearly every artistic tradition of the Middle Ages. If a medieval forger created this, he did not just need to be a talented artist, he needed to be a master of Roman anatomy and crucifixion mechanics, knowledge that had been lost for 1,000 years. The first and shocking detail lies in the hands. For centuries, Christian art, from the earliest icons to the great Renaissance masters, depicted Jesus with nails driven through the palms of his hands. However, modern experiments with cadavers have proven that the palm cannot support the weight of a human body. The flesh would simply tear and the body would fall. The man on the shroud, however, does not have nail wounds in the palms. The puncture marks are located in the wrist, specifically in a small anatomical gap known as the space of Disto. A nail driven here is anchored by the bones of the wrist and arm, easily supporting a man's weight. This is a brutal detail of Roman efficiency that no 14th century artist would have known or dared to depict, as it went against all religious iconography of the time. Furthermore, looking closely at the hands, one notices a strange anomaly. Only 4 fingers are visible. The thumbs are missing. This is not an artistic error, it's a physiological reaction. A nail driven through the space of disto severs or crushes the median nerve. This trauma causes the thumb to spasm and retract inward, hiding it under the palm. It's a subtle, medically accurate reaction to nerve damage that wasn't understood by science until centuries later. The autopsy continues to the back of the figure. The dorsal image reveals a man who was savagely beaten. Forensic pathologists have counted over 120 individual dumbbell-shaped wounds covering the back, shoulders, and legs. These marks perfectly match the flagrum, a whip with multiple leather thongs tipped with lead or bone weights. The angle of the strikes suggests 2 torturers, one taller than the other, standing on either side of the victim. The wounds are not random. They show a systematic application of pain designed to bring a man to the edge of death without killing him. Finally, there's the wound in the side. Located between the 5th and 6th ribs, there is a large elliptical puncture consistent with the thrust of a Roman lancia. The blood flow from this wound is distinct. Forensic analysis suggests a separation of blood and clear serum, blood and water, which occurs medically after death due to hypovolemic shock and heart failure. Every square inch of the cloth screams of anatomical reality. There are no brush strokes, no directional lighting, and no artistic embellishment. There is only the raw biological data of a violent execution recorded with cold precision. In October 1978, the mystery moved from the realm of observation to the realm of hard science. The Vatican granted permission for the Shroud of Turin research project, known as STURP, to examine the cloth. This was not a group of theologians. It was a team of 33 top-tier American scientists, including experts from the Los Alamos National Laboratories and engineers who worked with NASA. They brought tons of equipment to Turin with a single goal: to determine how the image was formed. They had 120 hours of direct access to the relic. They expected to find paint, dye, or some form of scorching agent. They expected to prove it was a fake and go home. Instead, they found the impossible. After thousands of tests, including X-ray fluorescence and infrared spectroscopy, the team reached a baffling conclusion. There is no paint, no dye, no pigment, and no brush strokes. The image is not absorbed into the linen like a liquid would be. It sits only on the very topmost surface of the fibers. In fact, the coloration penetrates only 0.2 micrometers deep, thinner than a human hair. If you scrape the fiber, the image disappears. Whatever created this image did not touch the cloth in a way we understand. It merely oxidized the surface cellulose with microscopic precision. But the most terrifying discovery came when they analyzed the image's density. 2 Air Force captains, John Jackson and Eric Jumper, decided to run a photograph of the shroud through a VP8 image analyzer. This machine was used by NASA to convert 2D photographs of Mars and the Moon into 3D topographic maps. It works by interpreting light intensity as distance. Lighter areas are closer, darker areas are farther. When you put a normal photograph, like a picture of your family, into a VP8, the result is a distorted mess because a photo does not contain distance information. The nose looks flat, the eyes look sunk in. But when they scanned the Shroud of Turin, the room went silent. The monitor did not show a distorted mess. It rendered a perfect, anatomically correct 3D relief of a human form. The intensity of the image on the cloth was directly proportional to the distance between the body and the linen. The tip of the nose which touched the cloth was darkest. The cheeks slightly further away were lighter. This meant that the image contained encoded 3D spatial data. A medieval forger would have had to paint with an impossible algorithm, darkening the paint in perfect proportion to the distance between a hypothetical body and the cloth, a concept of physics that wouldn't be discovered until the computer age. The STURP team's final report was humble but shattering. The image is not the product of an artist. They could tell us what it wasn't, but science to this day cannot fully explain what it is. For 10 years after the Stirp expedition, the Shroud enjoyed a golden age of scientific validation. But in 1988, the Vatican allowed the one test that the world had been demanding: radiocarbon dating. Small strips were cut from the corner of the cloth and sent to 3 prestigious laboratories: the University of Arizona, Oxford University, and the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. On October 13, 1988, the results were announced in a press conference that felt more like a courtroom verdict. The labs were unanimous. They dated the flax used to weave the linen to a window between 1260 and 1390 AD. The headlines the next morning were brutal and absolute: "Shroud a fake, medieval hoax confirmed." For the scientific community, the case was closed. The shroud was just a clever piece of medieval art, created exactly when historical record. This remained a theory until 2005, when Ray Rogers, a thermal chemist from the Los Alamos National Laboratory and a member of the original STURP team, published a bombshell paper in the peer-reviewed journal Thermochemica Acta. Rogers managed to obtain leftover fibers from the actual sample used in the 1988 carbon-14 test. Under the microscope, he found something that did not exist on the rest of the shroud. The main body of the shroud is pure bleached linen, but the C14 sample contained cotton fibers twisted in with the linen. Furthermore, the fibers in the sample were coated in a plant gum and a madder root dye, materials used by medieval weavers to stain new threads to match old yellowed linen. Rogers' conclusion was chemically irrefutable. The sample cut in 1988 was not representative of the main cloth. They had accurately dated a medieval patch, effectively performing a paternity test on the wrong child. The C14 result was null and void. The case was reopened. If the image is not paint, not dye, not a scorch from a hot statue, and not a photograph, then what is it? This question has plagued researchers for decades. The most recent and compelling answer comes from the Italian National Agency for New Technologies, Energy and Sustainable Economic Development, INEA. After years of trying to replicate the specific yellowing of the linen fibers, they finally succeeded. But the method they had to use was terrifying in its implications. They could not reproduce the image with chemicals or heat. They achieved a similar result only by blasting linen with excimer lasers, short bursts of vacuum ultraviolet radiation. The scientists concluded that to create the image on the shroud, the body wrapped inside it would have to emit a burst of light energy equivalent to 34 billion watts of vacuum ultraviolet radiation. To put that in perspective, this is more power than any searchlight in existence. Furthermore, this burst had to be incredibly short, lasting less than 1/40 billionth of a second. If the burst lasted any longer, the heat would have simply incinerated the cloth. If it were any weaker, it would have left no mark. This leads to the event horizon theory, that for a fraction of a second, the body inside the cloth dematerialized, transforming from matter into pure light energy. This radiation moved vertically, up and down, scorching the linen with the projected image of the body before the cloth collapsed through the space where the body used to be. This theory explains the X-ray properties found on the cloth. When we look closely at the hands on the shroud, the fingers appear unusually long. Forensic experts realized that we are not just seeing the skin, we are seeing the phalanges, the bones underneath. Similarly, the 3D scans of the face seem to show the roots of the teeth beneath the lips. This is consistent with a radiation source emitting from within the body, passing through flesh and bone to imprint onto the linen, exactly like a medical X-ray. There is one more detail that anchors this event in history. In the late 1970s, researchers analyzing the high-resolution photographs noticed circular protrusions over the eyes of the man. Using image enhancement technology, they identified faint letters and a shepherd's crook design.
These markings correspond perfectly to a Roman lepton, a small bronze coin minted by Pontius Pilate between 29 and 32 AD. It was a Jewish burial custom to place coins over the eyes to keep them closed. If this is true, the radiation event was so detailed that it captured the microscopic relief of the coins placed on the eyelids. This not only dates the cloth to the exact time of Christ, but suggests that the flash captured everything in its path with a resolution that rivals modern laser printing. We are left with a staggering physical reality. The cloth is a photographic plate, and the resurrection, if that is what this was the flashbulb. After more than a century of photography, chemistry, pathology, and physics, we are left with a puzzle that modern science cannot solve. We know what the shroud is not. It is not a painting, there is no pigment. It is not a scorch, there is no heat damage to the fibers. It is not a photograph, it contains three-dimensional topographical data. It is an image formed by a burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation printed on a 1st century herringbone linen cloth that contains pollen specific to the area of Jerusalem. But the final piece of evidence is not chemical, it is statistical. In 1978, mathematicians calculated the probability that a random man in history would possess all the specific wounds depicted on the shroud. Consider the variables. The man was scourged with a Roman flagrum, common. He was crucified with nails, common. But he also wore a cap of thorns, which caused distinct bleeding patterns on the scalp, a uniquely recorded torture for Jesus of Nazareth to mock his claim of kingship. He was stabbed in the side after death instead of having his legs broken, which was the standard Roman coup de grace known as crurifragium. He was buried in a hasty manner without the body being washed, yet wrapped in fine linen. When you multiply these probabilities, the odds of this being anyone other than the Jesus described in the Gospels is 1 in 200 billion. So, who is the man in the cloth? For the believer, it's a love letter left behind in the tomb, a snapshot of the exact moment death was defeated. For the skeptic, it remains the single most impossible object in archaeological history, a silent witness that refuses to be debunked, staring back at us across 2,000 years with eyes that saw the other side of death. Father Gabriele Amort, the Vatican exorcist we spoke of in our previous documentary, often said that the devil fears the shroud because it is the proof of his defeat. Whether you see it as a miracle or a mystery, one thing is undeniable. The face on this linen has haunted history. It demands a response. As you look into these eyes, you are looking at the most analyzed face in human existence. And perhaps, just perhaps, you are looking at the face of God. From the dark files of the Vatican to the bright lasers of modern laboratories, the truth is often stranger than fiction. Thank you for joining us on this investigation. If you want to see more documentaries uncovering the mysteries of the faith, make sure to subscribe to the Church Unveiled and ring the bell. And now, I turn the question to you. Is this the result of a medieval genius who outsmarted NASA, or is it the physical proof of the resurrection? Tell me your verdict in the comments below.